My name is Stephanie, and even when I say my name out loud, it seems to me that it sounds a little softer than I am. I have always been stubborn, always went where my head and heart called me, even if the whole world around me said that it was stupid. I am 33 years old, I work as an interior designer in a fairly large company, and to be honest, I am lucky. The salary is good, my colleagues respect me, and the projects that I lead bring me pleasure. But this story is not at all about how I select shades of fabric for curtains or draw another sketch for a client. This story is about the most difficult and important decision in my life, which, as it turned out, not only turned my existence upside down, but also hit my family hard, turning us into almost strangers. About 6 months ago, I suddenly decided, it's time. I want to buy a house. But not just any house from the brokerage brochures with the perfect facade and fresh lawn, but the one I found in the ads, and which would have made any sane person's hair stand on end. The house looked like no one had lived there for the last 20 years. Peeling paint, rotten shutters, weeds higher than the knees, a backyard that looked like a wild jungle, and photographs that seemed to be deliberately trying to push away. It all literally screamed, money pit, disaster, madness. But you know what? I didn't see it as a ruin, but as an opportunity. There was potential, there was air for the future, and most importantly, a backyard, which I had been missing all my life. My entire adult life, I lived in cramped apartments with noisy neighbors, with thin walls through which you could hear other people's grief and other people's quarrels. And I was mortally sick of all this. I dreamed of my own space, a place where I didn't have to ask permission to hang a swing or plant roses, where everything would be mine and mine alone. And when I saw the price, I knew it was a sign. The house was so cheap for what it was that I could afford a mortgage without the fear of dying of debt. My family took the news as if I'd announced my intention to move to a cave. At Sunday dinner, my mother nearly choked when I said, "I'm buying a house." She pressed her lips together, looked straight at me and said, "Stephanie, what are you thinking? You can buy a normal apartment with everything ready. Why get involved in this disaster?" My dad didn't argue. He just sat there shaking his head and sighing every now and then, as if I was about to spend not only my money, but theirs as well. "This house will suck up all your energy and all your savings," he finally said, and I could tell he was sure of it. Even my younger brother, Jake, who usually stuck close to me, snorted, "Seriously, Em, this sounds like a nightmare, not a dream. Just buy a real apartment." And as always, his wife, Sarah, was sitting next to me. She didn't say much, but every time I started talking about my plans, I noticed her rolling her eyes. She did it in a particularly offensive way, like I was some stupid girl who couldn't see the obvious. Sarah always found something to pick on. She acted like she knew everything better than everyone else, even though, to be honest, she'd never had a real job. She was trying to be some kind of blogger, spending hours on her phone taking selfies, and looked like she thought it was a worthy endeavor. I could tell she was skeptical, but I didn't care. I wanted this house. I could see its future beauty through the dirt and cracks, and I was filled with excitement at the thought of renovation. I was constantly dealing with construction crews at work. I knew who was reliable and who was slacking off, and I knew I could organize everything. And so I decided. I submitted the documents, got approved for a mortgage, signed a bunch of papers, and one morning I held the keys in my hands. I walked into this terrible living room with peeling walls and a musty smell and felt an incredible surge of energy. Now this is mine. Then began the longest and most exhausting period of my life. 6 months of renovation. 6 months when I lived between construction dust and receipts. I did some things myself. I tore off old wallpaper, painted the walls, did the gardening, more serious things. Electrics, plumbing, the roof. I trusted the workers. Luckily, the guys I worked with on projects at the company agreed to help me for half the usual price, and that saved my wallet. Otherwise, I would have drowned in debt long ago. I spent most of my weekends at Home Depot, learning the difference between latex and acrylic paint, or choosing faucets I had never even thought about before. I pulled out old carpet myself. I cursed every nail. I learned to hold a drill without shaking my fingers. Of course, there were moments when I doubted my sanity, like when it turned out that all the wiring in the house was in a deplorable state and everything needed to be replaced from scratch, or when it rained for several days in a row and I suddenly discovered that the roof was leaking so much that drops fell right in the bedroom. But little by little, everything began to take shape. Fresh paint covered the cracks of the past. The floors became strong, as if they were bringing the house back to life. The new kitchen shone like the heart of my future, and the garden, which had once been a wild forest, was turning into a place where I could have a picnic or a glass of wine in silence. I felt I had not gotten involved in this madness in vain. With each passing week, the house became a little more like the place I had imagined, and I found myself admiring even the little things. A new lamp in the hallway, the smell of fresh wood after renovation, or the even line of the lawn, which for the first time in my life I mowed myself. The more I did, the more proud I became, and that was when the idea was born. Why not have a housewarming party? A celebration where everyone would see the result of my efforts, where I would finally be able to show not photographs, but a real house in which I had invested half a year of my life. At another Sunday dinner at my parents', I decided to announce it. As always, sitting at the long table were my mom and dad, Jake and Sarah, who came here every weekend for dinner because there was no room for guests in their tiny rented apartment, where the kitchen was right next to the couch. We finished my mom's lasagna, and when the plates were empty, I sighed and said, "I'm having a housewarming party next Saturday. I'd love it if you could come and see the house when it's finished." And then, as if on cue, Sarah burst out laughing. It wasn't just a laugh. It was so poisonous that I felt like I heard a door click shut between us forever. "I'm not going to that pigsty," she said loudly, laughing as if she just told a brilliant joke. It took my breath away. I sat there and thought, who the hell says that? Who is so rude as to belittle someone else's work to their face? I forced out, "Actually, I did a major renovation. But if you don't want to come, you don't have to." Sarah went pale at that point, then blushed. Her face turned red, like a child caught in the act of a crime, and she snapped her mouth shut. She said nothing for the rest of the evening, sitting with her arms folded across her chest, looking like someone had taken away her favorite toy. My parents looked at each other, clearly unsure of how to act. Jake picked at his plate with his fork and pretended he wasn't there. But in the end, they all promised to come, although their promises sounded like they were preparing an excuse for themselves in advance. When Saturday came, I was nervous from the very morning. I set the table, prepared light snacks, turned on the music, and was ready by 6 o'clock. The first guests showed up exactly at the appointed time. My colleagues, friends, and new neighbors. The house came alive with voices and laughter and the smell of wine, and everyone who walked in stopped, looked around, and said, "Oh my God, Stephanie, this is amazing." The tile, the light, the taste. They asked about the details, complimented the work, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like all those sleepless nights and endless trips to Home Depot had been worth it. But the longer the evening went on, the heavier my heart became. An hour passed, then an hour and a half, and the guests were already on their second drinks, and my family still hadn't arrived. I was almost sure they'd changed their minds and left me looking like a fool when I heard the sound of cars pulling up. My heart sank when I saw their faces through the window, tense, like they were preparing for the worst, like they were about to enter a disaster zone and not my house. They walked in, and everything changed in an instant. Mom gasped, "Oh my God, Stephanie." Her eyes sparkled. She looked around, touched the shelves, ran her fingers along the walls, and I could see that she was truly amazed. "This is gorgeous." "You have such taste," she said, and I almost burst into tears. At that moment, I felt like I had finally justified myself to them, that they had seen what I had been living for these months. But the joy did not last long. I noticed Sarah wandering around the house, but her eyes did not sparkle with admiration. She did not smile, but on the contrary, as if she was looking for every crack, every flaw. She peered into corners, ran her finger along surfaces, squinted at the fresh paint, and there was anger in her eyes. It looked pathetic. She was trying so hard to find a reason to criticize, but the house was shining, and there was nothing to find fault with. After a while, I noticed that she was not among the guests, and then she came down the stairs and said loudly, deliberately so that everyone could hear, "The color in your bedroom is terrible." I would change it. The room fell silent. I smiled, trying not to show how hurt I was by her words. Well, when you have your own house, you can paint the walls any color, even pink. I added that last part on purpose, because Sarah was obsessed with pink, and everyone knew it. The effect was immediate. Her face turned bright red, as if she was boiling inside, and I could see that she was about to explode. "Come on, Jake! We're leaving!" she snapped and stormed toward the door. Jake, caught between two fires, looked at me with an apologetic look in his eyes, but of course he followed her. My parents looked confused and disappointed, shook their heads and left too, as if they didn't know whose side to take. And you know what? When the door slammed behind them, I suddenly felt relieved. The party was going on. People were laughing, toasting my courage, and without their sour faces, everything was 100 times better. After all this stress with the housewarming, I decided that it would be better to leave everything as it was and give the family time to cool down, let them digest it, let each digest it in their own way. But literally, a week later, my mother surprised me by calling me herself, her voice sounding softer than usual and asking if she could come over again to see the house in peace. "Just the two of us this time," she said. "I feel terrible about how Saturday ended. I'd really like to walk through the rooms without all the drama, without all the tension," and I immediately agreed because I heard the sincerity in her words that had been so lacking lately. She came over the weekend and the visit was surprisingly warm. My mother walked through the house slowly, stopping at each room, asking me about my design decisions, praising the color of the walls, the furniture, the way I'd used the lighting. We sat together in my new kitchen, drank coffee from bright mugs, and for the first time I felt that she saw me not as a stubborn daughter who had gone against her advice, but as a grown woman who knew what she wanted. She put her hand on mine and said, "Stephanie, I have to admit, your father and I were wrong. We tried to talk you out of it, and you were right. You knew what you were doing. I had to stop myself from crying, because those were the words I'd been waiting to hear all along. We had a wonderful time, and as she was about to leave, I did what I'd been thinking about for a long time. I handed her the spare key. Here, Mom. If I ever go out of town or something, maybe you could water my plants or just check in." She hugged me tightly, took the key, and held it to her heart. And in that moment, I felt like maybe we really were getting back to normal, despite everything that had happened with Jake and Sarah. Everything seemed to go back to normal, only in the right direction. Mom came over a few more times over the next few months. Sometimes she would bring groceries and we would cook dinner together, like we used to when I lived at home, only now in my kitchen, among my pots and plates. Sometimes she would just come in for a cup of tea, ask how I was doing, tell me about my neighbor or my dad, and it was really nice to feel that closeness again, that simple female connection between us. But with Jake and Sarah, it was completely different. I hardly heard from them. Jake would send short messages from time to time about something neutral, the weather, sports, some nonsense, but he never even hinted at home or that ill-fated party. Sarah, on the other hand, disappeared from my sight completely, and frankly, I was more than happy with that. Dad was somewhere in the middle. He didn't ignore me completely, but he didn't make any moves towards me. He just kept aloof. So 4 months passed. I was back to my usual routine. Work was going well, projects were fun. I was enjoying every day in my home, which was becoming a real fortress for me. Sometimes I would go out with someone just for fun, and life in general seemed easy and good. But one Thursday night, the phone rang, and I knew right away that something was wrong. My mother spoke slowly, as if choosing her words carefully, and her voice was cautious. "Stephanie, honey, do you want to come to dinner this Saturday? It's been a long time since we've had a family get-together." There was something unusual in her tone, as if she was afraid of something, and it made me suspicious. But I said yes, because I missed our family evenings, and I thought that maybe enough time had passed for things to return to normal. On Saturday, I went to my parents'. As soon as I pulled up to the house, I saw Jake and Sarah's cars, and wasn't surprised at all. They occupied my parents' house on weekends, as usual. I walked into the house, and Jake was the first to say, "Hi, Em." His voice was surprisingly friendly, and this made me even more wary than if he had remained silent. Sarah barely looked up at me, but at least her gaze wasn't full of poison, and that already seemed like a small victory. We sat down at the table. Mom had made a stew, her signature dish, which was always incredibly tasty and filled the house with the smell of childhood, warmth, and something very reliable. At first, the conversation at dinner was cautious and as if through a taut film. Everyone tried to be polite, asking only safe questions about work, about the weather, about where gas was cheaper, and what the neighbor's harvest was like this year. I even felt a strange relief. It seemed that everything was going smoothly, but inside I was worried, as if I knew that the real reason for calling me was still ahead. And then, right at that moment, when I was telling a story about one particularly difficult client, Mom carefully put down her fork, looked at me with her soft smile, the same one with which she always covered up something serious, and said, "Stephanie, I wanted to talk to you about something." The living room immediately fell silent. Everyone stopped eating and stared at me, and Jake gave me that puppy dog grin I remembered from when he was little, the one he'd give me when he wanted me to give him a toy or cover for him in front of my parents. And I knew where this was going even before my mom said the words. Jake and Sarah's lease on their house is up soon, and with everything going on in the economy and Jake's job troubles, it's going to be harder and harder for them to find something they can afford. At that moment, something inside me twisted, a cold hand in my stomach, because I already knew how this speech was going to end. "We were thinking," my mom continued, her voice still soft like she was talking about nothing. "Maybe they could stay with you for a while, just temporarily, until they get back on their feet." The room was dead silent, and I could feel all the eyes falling on me. Jake still smiling his pathetic hope, Dad avoiding my gaze, and Mom waiting as if she knew I would say yes. I took a deep breath and forced out, "I don't want anyone else in my house." Mom's face immediately fell. "Stephanie, it's not anyone else," she said sharply. "It's your brother and his wife." "I know," I said, trying to sound calm, even though my voice was shaking, "but the answer is still no." That's when Sarah, who had been silent until then, decided to intervene. Her words cut like a knife. "I always knew you were greedy and arrogant." I looked her straight in the eye and said calmly, "It's funny, because I remember when you said at my housewarming party that you didn't want to come to my pigsty, and now you're ready to live in it." Sarah just shrugged, as if it meant nothing. "Well, if it's free, I guess I can handle it." The courage of this woman was incredible. And then Jake switched on his whiny tone, which I hated since childhood. "Come on, Em, you have to understand my situation." "My job is downsizing. My salary was cut by 20%. We are really in trouble." I looked from him to Sarah and said, "Maybe Sarah should get a job instead of pretending to be a blogger and doing this nonsense all day." Sarah's face immediately flushed bright red. "How dare you?" she shouted. "I'm just saying," I continued coldly, "if there's not enough money in the house, then maybe both adults should work." And then Sarah completely lost her composure. She burst into tears, really theatrically, loudly, with sobs, and jumped up and ran out of the dining room. I heard her stomping her feet up the stairs to my old bedroom, like a teenager upset with her parents. "Look what you've done!" Jake shouted, jumping up from his chair. "You're such a fool, Stephanie." And he ran after his wife, not even looking me in the eye. My parents remained seated at the table, and their eyes pierced me. They looked at me as if I were the worst daughter in the world, as if all the fault was mine alone. I felt the anger and resentment suffocating me, and so I hurried to finish my dinner without saying another word and left as quickly as I could. After that disastrous evening, everything around me froze. and I mean completely. No one called me. No one wrote. No one invited me to dinner on Saturday. Jake had disappeared. Sarah seemed to have never existed, and my mother had stopped sending me her usual short messages. It was as if I had been cut out of the family. A whole month passed in silence, and not a word from them. And to be honest, I felt a strange relief. I didn't want to feel guilty anymore about letting Jake and Sarah move into my house, so I reminded myself every day that I had made the right choice in saying no. I had my own life, and I was enjoying the peace and quiet and the feeling that I was finally living the life I had always wanted. I felt more at home in this house than ever before, as if every wall, every picture, and every little detail belonged to me and reflected my heart. Friends started dropping by more often. We cooked dinners, laughed in the kitchen, discussed work and men, and not once did anyone allow themselves to make a snide comment about my choice of furniture or the color of the walls. I began to take on small projects around the house again, changing curtains, choosing new plants for the garden, and this brought me a calm I had not felt for a long time. Then one Tuesday, everything changed abruptly. I had a meeting with a new potential client at 2 p.m. It was a big renovation project with a really good budget, and I was nervous because this could be a big step in my career. But at about 11:30, the client called and said that she had to reschedule due to some family emergency. I replied that it was no problem at all, and even felt relieved that now I had time to do my paperwork. Then I remembered that I had left some of the paperwork at home and decided to go back and work there for the rest of the day. I pulled up to my house around noon, 3 hours earlier than I usually did on Tuesdays, and as soon as I turned into the street, I noticed 2 cars parked right in front of my house. I recognized one instantly. It was my parents' car. The other, dark blue, belonged to Jake. My first thought struck like lightning. Maybe something terrible had happened, some kind of emergency, and they had come to me without getting through on the phone. But almost immediately, I realized that if that were really the case, they would have called first and not acted in such a strange way. With a heavy heart, I took out the key, opened the door, and immediately felt that something was wrong. The hallway and the living room were in complete chaos. My things were everywhere. The furniture from my bedroom was right in the hallway and in the corner of the living room. My dresser, my nightstand, even the lamps that I had chosen myself and that fit perfectly with the interior. I froze, not understanding what was happening, and then I heard voices upstairs, loud, animated, as if people were busy with work. My heart began to pound wildly as I slowly climbed the stairs, step by step approaching my bedroom. The voices were coming from there, from my master bedroom, from the very place where I had put my soul, choosing the color of the walls, the furniture, and every little thing. I walked down the hall, stopped at the door, and almost lost the power of speech from what I saw. In the room were my parents, Jake and Sarah, who was standing in the middle of the bedroom with a smug, wide smile, as if this was all her personal victory. Besides them, there were 2 unfamiliar men in robes with rollers and brushes in their hands. They were painting my walls, the very walls I'd spent weeks shopping for and agonizing over until I found the perfect shade. And now they were being rolled in a bright, cheap pink that looked like Pepto-Bismol. My breath caught in my throat and the words came out of my mouth. What the hell is going on here? I screamed so loudly that everyone jumped and turned around. One of the workers stopped, holding a roller against the wall, and stared at me with a stupid expression. My parents looked like they'd been caught in the act. Jake froze like a deer in headlights, and Sarah continued to stand in the center, flashing her nasty smile. "Oh, okay, your house," she said in a tone that sounded casual, and there was no regret in her voice. "We decided to redo the master bedroom before Jake and I move in. Do you like the color?" I was so angry that I could barely speak. My hands were shaking, and I felt a scream rising in my throat. "Stop!" I shouted at the workers. "Stop painting my walls right now!" They looked at each other, confused, and with an uncertain shrug, they put down their brushes and rollers. I turned to my mother, my hands literally shaking with anger. "What the fuck are you doing? How did you even get in here?" I almost spat the words out, and she gave me a calm, forced-to-be-gentle smile that made me shudder. I used my key, honey. We're all family, and we knew you wanted Jake and Sarah to be comfortable when they moved in. I almost screamed, "Move! Are you serious? I told you no. I told you no." But she didn't blink, and my father, standing next to me, put in his word. "We knew you'd come to your senses. You always do the right thing in the end." My blood was pounding in my ears, and I didn't recognize my own voice when I growled, "Right? Is this what you think is right? Letting these two break into my house and destroy my bedroom? Get the hell out of here." I stepped forward, pointing my finger at the door, and each word came out of me like a gunshot. "Get out of my house right now or I'm calling the police." All I heard in response was my parents' moralizing tone, lecturing me about how families should always stick together, how I was being selfish and disgraceful. Jake got all worked up like a teenager, screaming that I didn't understand what he was going through, that as his sister I had to support him, that I was betraying him in his darkest hour. And Sarah, who had been standing there with that nasty look on her face, couldn't help but snap, "You're an ungrateful, selfish person, and you always have been." The workers, smart guys, immediately realized that the situation was going to hell, and without further ado, they began to gather up their tools. One of them muttered, "Good luck," and they both slid past me before it could turn into a fight. I watched them go and repeated, more quietly but firmly, as if each word were burning, "I'm serious. Get out. Now. Or I'll throw you out the door myself." They looked at each other, and although they had been looking at me as if I had lost my mind, there was enough steel in my voice to convince them that I was serious. One by one, they reluctantly left my bedroom, went down the stairs, and left the house without saying a word. I was left standing in the middle of the room, looking at the walls, and a feeling of nausea rose in my throat. Half the wall was still that beautiful cold gray that I had chosen after so much suffering, and the other half was already splattered with that disgusting pink, as if the room had turned into a cheap doll's box. I was shaking with rage, but I knew I had to act fast and hard now. These people had proven they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, and if I didn't set a boundary for them, they would tear down everything that mattered to me. The first thing I did was grab my phone and dial Mike, one of my trusted workers who had helped me with the renovation from the start. "Mike, I need you to come over right now and change all the locks. This is an emergency," I said, and there was no hesitation in my voice. He didn't ask any questions, just said, "I'll be there in half an hour." While I waited for him, I jumped in my car and drove to the hardware store, where I bought cans of paint in the exact shade of gray I had originally chosen. I knew that tonight, until the morning, I would erase every trace of the nightmare they had tried to create in my bedroom. Mike arrived promptly and changed all the locks, no questions asked. The front door, the back door, even the garage door. When he left, I was left alone and set about repainting. I worked like a madwoman, rolling the roller over and over, scrubbing away the toxic pink gunk until the walls were back to their former noble color. By midnight, I was barely able to stand. By 2 a.m, every muscle ached. But when I stepped back and looked at the walls, my heart beat more steadily for the first time that day. My bedroom looked normal again, just like I had planned. I was so nervous that I couldn't even lie down in that room and moved to the guest room, where I fell into a fitful sleep. In the morning, I got everyone back on their feet. I called a couple more guys from the team, and they helped put the furniture back in place. But I didn't stop there. I did what I should have done months ago. I called the security company and without hesitation said, "I want a full security system. Perimeter cameras, alarms, sensors on the doors and windows, everything." And they came that same day. They installed cameras on every corner of the house, motion sensors in every room, a system connected to an app on my phone so I could monitor everything 24/7. When the job was done and I turned on the system for the first time, I suddenly felt like I could breathe again. My house was protected, the locks were changed, and if anyone else dared to pull a similar stunt, I would have ironclad proof. and I realized that this was the best investment I had ever made. And as it turned out, I realized this much earlier than I expected. It had only been a few days since I had my security system installed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could relax. So I was sitting at my desk with a mug of coffee, going over sketches and going over the details of my upcoming project, when my phone vibrated so loudly I almost knocked the cup over. The screen was flashing red. The security app had sent me a notification. Motion detected. Attempted entry through the main entrance. Alarm has been triggered. My heart sank. My palms were sweating. I froze for a second, but then I opened the app and turned on the live feed from the camera, and what I saw made me freeze in horror and rage at the same time. Standing right outside my door was Jake. My own brother, the same one who had recently listened to me screaming and promising to call the police, was now standing in front of my camera like a petty thief, and he had a key in his hand. I recognized it immediately. It was an old spare key I'd once given to my mother so she could water the plants while I was away. I watched as Jake slid it into the lock, twisted it, turned it, jabbed it again, growing increasingly annoyed until he finally realized I'd changed the locks. He stepped back, glanced over his shoulder as if checking to see if the neighbors were watching, and for a second, I thought he was going to leave. But he didn't. I watched as he went to his car, rummaged through the trunk, and came back with a crowbar. A fucking crowbar! I pressed my hand to my lips to keep from screaming in horror. My brother, my own brother, was about to break into my house like a criminal. I watched as he shoved the crowbar into the doorframe and began to yank, throwing his weight around as if he could force the door open. At that moment, the siren went off. Deafening and shrill, the lights flashing on the camera, and I saw Jake jerk, drop the crowbar, look around in panic, then sprint back to his car and take off like there was an army after him. I sat there clutching the phone to my chest, unable to believe what I had just seen. I knew things had gotten really bad between us in the last few months, but never in my worst nightmares had I imagined that he would actually try to break into my house. This wasn't just an act of desperation, it was a crime. I saved the video and didn't hesitate for a second. I drove straight to the police station. I want to file a report for attempted breaking and entering, I told the girl at the front desk, my voice shaking but my eyes looking her straight in the eye. They took me seriously, especially when I showed them the video. It was all there. Jake's face, him fiddling with the old key, then taking out the crowbar and trying to force the door open. No hesitation, no excuses. I filed a report, gave them the tape, and they said they'd get back to me about next steps. I went home with a heavy but firm feeling that I'd done the right thing, and yet, inside, I was bitter because this was my brother, my own brother, and he'd crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. On Saturday night, the phone rang, and I immediately saw my mom's name. I answered, and she screamed over the phone, "Stephanie, what have you done?" "The police came to our house and arrested Jake. They said you filed a report that he tried to break into your house." I took a deep breath and answered as calmly as I could, "He tried to break into my house. I have video evidence." But my mother wouldn't listen. She was sobbing and screaming, "You need to go and drop the charges right now. This is your brother we're talking about." I clenched my teeth and anger boiled inside me. Maybe my brother shouldn't have come to me with a crowbar and tried to break down the door. But my mother only cried louder, whining that I was ruining the family, that I was cruel, that I was betraying my family. I listened to her hysteria and finally said, "Okay, I'll drop the charges, but only on one condition. You all leave me alone. No more uninvited visits, no more talk about them moving in with me, no more drama. You leave me alone." She immediately agreed, as if this was all she had been waiting for. "Yes, yes, of course. Anything, just drop the charges." I hung up, and immediately the phone exploded with calls. My dad, Jake, Sarah, they all took turns calling me, texting me, and their tone was different now, not threatening, not commanding, but pleading. They swore they would never bother me again, that they would fix everything, that I should feel sorry for my brother, that I had to withdraw my complaint. The messages grew more desperate. "Please, Stephanie, We promise to leave you alone. Just drop the charges. Forgive me. I'll never do it again. Just help me this time. We swear we won't bother you again. I put my phone on my nightstand and let them call and text me into the night. Let them sweat. Let them feel a little of the terror I felt when I saw my brother trying to break into my house with a crowbar. The next morning, I woke up feeling heavy-headed, like I'd had a bottle of cheap wine overnight, but I still got dressed and walked back to the police station, my heart sinking with every step. I withdrew my report, and Jake was released that afternoon because, as it turned out, he had nothing serious on his record. No previous convictions, no shady dealings, just a blank record and a name that, sadly, was also mine. He was simply questioned, given a stern warning, and sent home. But it was enough to scare the crap out of him, and for the first time in his eyes, I think, the thought that he could actually get into serious trouble if he kept up the behavior was there. And you know what? It worked. After that, there was silence. No one from my family contacted me anymore. No calls, no texts, no attempts to make me feel guilty, no surprise visits to the door. Nothing. It was like they finally realized that I was serious and I wasn't going to back down. 6 months passed in complete peace, and they were the best months in all that time. No drama, no manipulation, no tearful calls. I could come home from work and know that my house would look exactly as I left it in the morning, without strangers' things, without strangers' smells, without strangers' hands touching my furniture. I could leave town for the weekend and be sure that when I returned, I wouldn't find my bedroom painted in yet another juicy color chosen by Sarah. I began to forget about all these scandals and thought that they were gradually fading from my memory, until one day I ran into my cousin Lisa at the grocery store. We always got along, but since all this mess we hadn't spoken, and I didn't even know how to act. Lisa, when she saw me, cried out, "Stephanie, my God, I'm so glad to see you," and hugged me so tightly as if I had just returned from a long exile. We chatted for a while about life, about work, about all sorts of nonsense. And then, of course, she started talking about family. "I heard Jake and Sarah are living with your parents now," she said, and her voice sounded sympathetic and judgmental and a little pity. Then she added, "Your mom mentioned that Sarah is pregnant. That's great, right?" I felt a chill go down my spine, but I just forced a smile on my face. Pregnant? Well, that explains a lot. Lisa continued, "Your mom says they're having serious financial problems, that Jake's job situation is still bad, and now there's a baby on the way. But I think they're happy to help because family is family." I nodded, muttered something non-committal, not wanting to discuss it in the aisles of pasta and dairy, and we quickly steered the conversation toward neutral topics. But on the way home, I kept going over her words. Jake and Sarah were living with my parents. Sarah was pregnant. They were still in debt and in trouble, and now they were dumping it all on Mom and Dad. Did I feel guilty? Maybe a little, deep down. But more than that, I felt relieved. Because this wasn't my problem, my burden, my life drowning in chaos. I made the right choice when I bought my house. I made the right choice when I renovated it exactly the way I wanted. I made the right choice when I didn't let them move in with me, despite the pressure and the tears and the accusations. And I definitely made the right choice when I installed the cameras and the alarm, and when I went to the police after Jake had the audacity to come to my house with a crowbar. Those were all good steps. My house is still beautiful. It's still peaceful and quiet. It's still mine alone. And every time I turn the key in the lock, I feel proud of myself. I'm proud of myself for standing up for myself, proud of myself for not letting anyone trample on my boundaries, proud of myself for choosing myself. Some people might say that makes me selfish, that it's cruel to my family. But you know what? I don't care. I've worked too long and too hard to let someone, even people with my blood, make my life a living hell. My family made their choices, and I made mine. And I'm not going to be responsible for them continuing to make mistakes and hoping someone else will pull them out of the swamp. I defended myself, I defended my home, my life from people who decided they had the right to walk all over me. And if all this happened again, I would do the same thing again without thinking. Because sometimes the only right way is to choose yourself, even if it hurts, even if it breaks relationships that seemed important, even if the whole world decides that you are selfish. Sometimes you just need to say, enough. This is my boundary. You will not go further, and live on, calmly, proudly, and by your own rules.